Welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here. Today, we drift back in time, far beyond modern medicine, uncertainty, into the dark and fragile world of the 14th century, a time when a single sickness reshaped civilization, silenced cities, and forced humanity to confront death on an unimaginable scale. In this video, we'll experience what it was truly like to live through the bubonic plague, not through dates and statistics, but through daily life, fear, survival, and endurance. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy deep, immersive history. Share it with someone who loves long-form storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more quiet, thoughtful journeys into the past. Now settle in and let's begin. Imagine waking before the sun is fully risen to a silence that feels wrong. The streets outside your home, usually alive with shouting merchants, animals, and footsteps, are quiet, not peaceful, empty. The air that slips through the cracks of wooden shutters carries a bitter mix of smoke, rot, and something far worse, fear. Church bells begin to ring, slow and heavy, their sound stretching across the town like a warning. They are not calling people to worship. They are counting the dead. You step outside and immediately, you know something has changed forever. A cart creaks past you, its wooden wheels scraping against stone. Inside it lie bodies, men, women, children stacked without ceremony. Some are wrapped in thin cloth, others exposed, their faces darkened, swollen, unrecognizable. No one follows the cart. No prayers are spoken. There are simply too many dead for that now. This is Europe in the middle of the 14th century, when the bubonic plague arrived. Like a slow-moving apocalypse, people would later call it the Black Death. But those living through it had no name for what was happening. They only knew that death had become a constant presence, closer and more personal than ever before. Life before the plague was already difficult. Most people were peasants, tied to the land, working from sunrise to sunset, just to serve. Hunger was common. Disease was familiar. Death was never far away, but nothing, no famine, no war, had prepared them for what was about to unfold. This was not suffering as they knew it. This was something entirely different. The plague did not announce its arrival with armies or banners. It came quietly, hidden in the shadows of trade and commerce. Far to the east, along the great trade routes of Asia, merchants traveled with caravans loaded with silk, spices, and precious goods. With them traveled rats, and on thosserates lived fleas. Inside the fleas was a bacterium no one could see or understand. It moved silently, patiently, waiting. As trade routes connected distant lands, the disease moved with them, town by town, port by port, it advanced. When merchant ships reached the shores of the Mediterranean, they carried more than cargo. Sailors stumbled onto docks, already sick, their skin hot with fever, their bodies weak. Some died before setting foot on land. Others survived just long enough to spread the disease further. At first, people tried to explain it away. Sickness was nothing new, a bad fever, perhaps something in the water. But soon, the number of deaths became impossible to ignore. Entire households fell ill within days. Neighbors stippled. Familiar faces vanished from the streets. Fear spread faster than any illness. People whispered in doorways and marketplaces. Some said the air itself had turned poisonous. Others blamed strange planetary alignments, claiming the stars had cursed the world. Many believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. When you do not understand something, you search for meaning wherever you can find it. As days passed, the signs became unmistakable. Healthy people collapsed suddenly, struck down without warning. Strong men who had worked the fields their entire lives were reduced to trembling feverishals within hours. Mothers watched their children burn with heat and cry in pain, unable to help them. Fathers prayed desperately, bargaining with God for mercy that never seemed to come. People began to lock their doors, hoping to keep death outside. Some painted symbols on their homes, believing they might ward off the disease. Others burned incense and herbs, filling their houses with smoke, in the hope that foul smells would drive away whatever evil lingered in the air. None of it worked. The streets grew emptier by the day. Shops closed, not because merchants chose to, but because they were dead or dying. Bakers stopped baking. Blacksmiths laid down their tools. Markets fell silent. Dogs and cats roamed freely, feeding on scraps and sometimes on the bodies of the dead. Ironically, killing these animals, believed by some to spread the plague, often made the situation worse, as it allowed rats to multiply unchecked. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Some said entire cities had been wiped out overnight. Others claimed the plague was unstoppable, that no one would survive. People spoke of ghost towns, where doors stood open and no living soul remained. Each new story made the terror feel more real. For many, the most frightening part was how sudden everything felt. One day, life continued as it always had. The next, it was gone. There was no gradual adjustment, no time to prepare. Weddings were canceled, harvests were abandoned. Long-term plans became meaningless. Survival was the only concern. Families faced impossible choices. When someone fell ill, should these stay and care for them, risking their own lives? Or should they flee, leaving loved ones behind to die alone? Many chose to run. Others stayed, paid the price. There was no right answer, only consequences. The wealthy often fled first. Those with money escaped cities for isolated countryside estates, believing distance would save them. Servants were sometimes left behind, locked inside homes, or dismissed without protection. The poor had no they remained in crowded neighborhoods, sharing small spaces where disease spread easily. As death became more common, people grew numb. The first funerals were filled with tears and prayers. Soon there were too many to mourn. Bodies were dragged outside and left for collection. In some places, families marked their doors to signal there were dead inside. In others, no one bothered anymore. The constant ringing of church bells became unbearable. At first, bells rang for every death, then only for groups of deaths. Eventually, they rang without pause until even the bells fell silent, either because no one was left to ring them, or because the sound had become meaningless. Time itself seemed to lose structure. Days blended together, markedly by sickness and death. People stopped counting weeks or months. They measured time by who was still alive. Faith was tested like never before. Churches filled with desperate worshippers, kneeling shoulder to shoulder, praying for salvation. Ironically, these gatherings often became centers of infection. Priests and monks died in massive numbers, tending to the sick and administering last rites. Some churches were forced to close simply because no clergy remained. Despite the terror, life did not stop completely. Babies were still born. Some people still laughed, still shared food, still found moments of human connection. These small acts of normality became acts of defiance against a world that seemed determined to end. Yet everywhere, the sense remained that civilization itself was fragile. Laws weakened as officials died. Order broke down. Thieves looted abandoned homes. Some people indulged in excess, believing tomorrow would never come. Others withdrew completely, living in isolation and silence. What made the plague especially horrifying was its randomness. There was no clear pattern. One household would be wiped out entirely, while the one next door served untouched. Young and old died alike. The strong fell as easily as weak. People searched desperately for rules that did not exist. Parents looked at their children and wondered how long they had left. Children grew up fast, surrounded by loss. Many would carry these memories for the rest of their lives if they lived long enough to grow old. This was only the beginning. The full scale of the disaster had not yet revealed itself. What people did not know, what they could not know, was that plague would return again and again, wave after wave, reshaping society in ways no one could imagine. In the early days, survival felt like a matter of faith, luck, and isolation. People clung to any hope they could find. Some believed the plague would burn itself out. Others believed the end of the world was near. Both felt equilibriable, and as the sun set each evening over towns growing quieter by the day, those still alive faced the same question every night. Would they wake up tomorrow? Or would they be another body on the cart, another nama forgotten, another bell toll in a world drowning in death? This was the first experience of the bubonic plague for those living in the 1300s, not yet the aftermath, not yet the lessons, but thorough terror of realizing that the world they knew was disappearing one body at a time. The sickness rarely announced itself loudly at first. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as something familiar: headache, a chill that lingered too long, a sense of exhaustion so deep it felt as if the body itself were giving up. People told themselves it would pass. They had worked through illness before. They had survived fevers, coughs, and infections countless times. This felt different, but hope is stubborn, especially when the alternative is unthinkable. Within hours, that hope began to crumble. Fever rose suddenly and violently. Skin burned to the touch while the victim shivered uncontrollably. Muscles ached as if being, even lifting Gone's head became unbearable. Eyes dulled, speech slowed, and confusion set in. Families watched in helpless silences. Loved ones slipped away from tea. As loved ones slipped away from them, not yet dead, but no longer truly present. Then came the swellings. Painful lumps appeared in places people rarely spoke about. Openly: the groin, the armpits, the neck. They grew rapidly, stretching the skin, until it darkened, bruised, and sometimes split. These swellings, later called buboes, were hard, tender, and terrifying. Everyone knew what they meant. Once the swellings appeared, death usually followed. As the disease advanced, the body seemed to betray itself. Black blotches spread across the skin as blot vessels burst beneath the surface. These marks gave the plague its most famous name. Breath became shallow and labored. Some victims coughed violently, spitting blood onto floors and bedding. Others vomited uncontrollably or suffered unbearable diarrhea, dehydrating them in hours. The stench of sickness filled homes, thick and suffocating. Most people died within 2 or 3 days of the first symptoms. Some died faster. Very few survived once the disease had fully taken hold. There was no gradual decline, no time to adjust. One momensamine was alive, speaking, thinking, breathing. The next, they were gone. Families learned to read the signs with dreadful accuracy. A fever alone might still bring hope. The appearance, off-swellings, crushed it. Mothers clutched their children and wept quietly. Husbands turned away, knowing what was coming, but unable to accept it. Many prayed not for survival, but for a quick death, believing prolonged suffering was worse than dying. Fear changed how people behaved toward one another. Compassion collided with terror. Caring for the sick often meant death for the caregiver. Families faced impossible choices. Should they tend to their loved ones, or should they protect themselves? Some stayed, holding hands until the end. Others fled, locking doors behind them, haunted forever by the memory of screams they chose not to answer. In crowded homes, isolation was impossible. Entire families fell ill together. Parents died first, leaving children alone with the dead. In some houses, everyone died within days. Doors remained closed not as a sign of safety, but as silent tombs. Neighbors avoided these houses, afraid even to pass by. Doctors were summoned, though few trusted them. Medieval medicine was based on ancient texts and theories, not observation or experiment. Illness was believed to result from imbalances in bodily fluids or corruption of the air. Physicians examined urine, checked pulses, and consulted astrological charts. They prescribed treatments with confidence, even as their patients continued to die. Bloodletting was common. Doctors believed removing blood would restore balance. Patients were cuter bled until they grew weak, often hastening death. Leeches were applied to swollen buboes. Poultices made of herbs, vinegar, or even crushed gemstones were smeared onto wounds. Some treatments were painful, others useless and ineffective. The idea that something invisible could cause disease did not exist. People could not imagine bacteria, fleas, or microscopic life. Instead, they blamed what they could see or smell. Bad air, miasma, was believed to carry sickness. Fires were lit in homes and streets to purify the air. Incense burned constantly. People carried flowers or herbs in small bundles, hoping pleasant smells would protect them. Some treatments bordered on the absurd. Patients were told to sit in sewers or surround themselves with filth to overpower the disease with stronger smells. Others were advised to avoid bathing, believing open pores allowed sickness to enter the body. In desperation, people tried anything. As doctors failed, trust in medicine collapsed. Some physicians fled cities entirely, choosing survival over duty. Others stayed and died alongside their patients. Medical knowledge offered no protection. Education did not save lives. Panic spread rapidly. Rumors claimed the plague was contagious through sight, sound, or even thought. People avoided eye contact. They crossed streets to avoid others. Friends stopped visiting one another. Fear isolated people long before illness did. The sick were often abandoned somewhere, forced out of their homes and left in the streets. Others were locked inside rooms, food pushed through crack-sand doors if it was delivered at all. Bells or markers were placed outside houses to warn others away. In some towns, guards patrolled streets, preventing the sick from moving freely. Hospitals, few and poorly equipped, were quickly overwhelmed. Beds filled immediately. Floors became resting places for the dying. The smell of death was constant. Staff fell ill and died. In many places, hospitals closed simply because no one was left to run them. Religion, once a source of comfort, became a battleground of belief and fear. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. Sermons grew darker. Preachers spoke of judgment, hellfire, and repentance. People confessed sins openly, hoping forgiveness would spare them. At the same time, faith was shaken. People asked why the innocent suffered alongside the guilty, why children died, why prayers went unanswered. Some lost faith entirely. Others clung to it more desperately than ever. Public gatherings became scenes of desperation. Crowds prayed together, sang hymns, and begged for mercy. Ironically, these gatherings often accelerated the spread of disease. The very acts meant to save souls ended lives instead. As death became routine, the emotional toll deepened. Grief lost its sharp edges and became dull, constant pain. People stopped crying. There were simply too many losses. Instead, a heavy numbness settled in. Survivors moved through their days like ghosts, performing necessary tasks without emotion. Children grew up surrounded by death. They watched parents, siblings, and friends die. Many became orphaned. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbors. Others survived alone, learning quickly how to fend for themselves in a world that no longer felt safe. The randomness of the plague was, perhaps, its most terrifying feature. No one understood why some survived while others died. Healthy young adults fell just as easily as the elderly. Priests died while criminals lived. The plague respected no boundaries of class, gender, or morality. This unpredictability destroyed any illusion of control. People searched desperately for patterns, for rules that might save them. None existed. Survival felt like a cruel lottery, decided by forces beyond human understanding. As days turned into weeks, cities changed beyond recognition. Streets that once bustled with life were silent. Windows were boarded up. Grass grew between stones where thousands once walked daily. Bells rang less often, not because death had slowed, but because there was no one left to ring them. In this environment, human behavior shifted dramatically. Some people indulged in excessing drinking and indulging in pleasures as if every day were their last. Others withdrew completely, living in isolation, avoiding all contact. Both responses were attempts to cope with the same overwhelming reality. Fear of infection reshaped social bonds. Handshakes disappeared. Embraces became rare. Even family members kept their distance. Love itself felt dangerous. Yet even in this darkness, moments of humanity persisted. Some caregiver stayed with the sick until the end, fully aware of the risk. Some neighbors shared food with those trapped inside quarantined homes. These acts were small, often unnoticed, but they mattered deeply to those involved. The plague revealed both the fragility and resilience of human society. It stripped away illusions, exposing how thin the line was between order and collapse. It showed how quickly fear could override compassion and how sometimes compassion served anyway. For those living through this second phase of the plague, reality narrowed to a single question each day. Would they fall ill next? Every ache was examined with dread. Every cough caused panic. Sleep offered no comfortably. The possibility of waking up sick or not waking up at all. And as the disease continued its relentless march, people began to realize that this was not a passing disaster. This was not a bad season or a temporary curse. This was something far larger, something that would leave no part of their world untouched. They did not yet know how deeply it would change a society, belief, labor, and power. All they knew was pain, fear, and the constant presence of death. The plague was no longer just a sickness. It had become the defining experience of their lives, shaping every thought, every choice, every breath they took if they were still breathing at all. As the plague tightened its grip, the familiar rhythms of daily life did not merely slow down, they collapsed entirely. What had once been a fragile but functioning system of labor, trade, worship, and community disintegrated under the Watef constant death. The world people depended on simply stopped working, not because anyone needs it too, but because there were no longer enough living bodies to keep it alive. Fields lay untouched, crops ripened and rotted where they grew, stalks bent under the weight of grain that no one would harvest. Orchards dropped fruit that fermented on the ground. Vineyards were swallowed by weeds. The seasonal patterns that had governed medieval life for centuries became meaningless. There were no hands to sow, no strength to reap, no Riasanto plan for a future that might never come. In towns and cities, commerce vanished almost overnight. Markets that once buzzed with shouting vendors and bargaining customers fell silent. Stalls stood empty, abandoned in mid-transaction. Scales rusted. Coins lay scattered where a merchants had fled or died. Bread ovens went cold. Taverns closed their doors, not from lack of customers, but from lack of owners. Animals moved freely through spaces once ruled by humans. Pigs wandered into city streets, rooting through refuse and sometimes through corpses. Horses stood untended in stables until they starved or broke free. Rats multiplied rapidly, feeding grain stores, and the dead alike unnoticed and unchecked. Nature reclaimed human spaces with unsettling speed. The collapse of food supply created a new terror layered on top of the plague. Hunger. Survivors scavenged for anything edible. People broke into abandoned homes, searching for grain or dried meat. Laws meant nothing when enforcement vanished. Theft became survival. Survival became everything. Burial, one of the most sacred duties in medieval society, became an impossible task. At first, families tried to unearth their dead. They washed bodies, wrapped them in cloth, whispered prayers. Soon, the number of dead overwhelmed every realm. Priests died faster than they could perform last rites. Cemeteries filled until there was no room left to dig. Bodies began to pile up in homes. In some places, families marked their doors with symbols or cloths to signal death inside. In others, they simply dragged the dead outside and left them in the street. The smell of decay hung over entire cities, thick and suffocating, clinging to clothing and hair. Mass graves became the only solution. Trenches were dug hastily outside city walls or in open fields. Corpses were stacked in layers, sometimes dozens deep, sprinkled with lime in the hope of slowing decay. There were no names, no markers, no remembrance. Death had become anonymous. Gravediggers emerged as the most essential figures in society and the most feared. They worked endlessly, hauling bodies day and night. Many were already infected, coughing and sweating as they labored. Some were criminals released from prisons in exchange for this work. Others were ordinary people desperate for food or coins. All knew their role likely guaranteed their own deaths. The living avoided gravediggers whenever possible. People believed they carried death itself with them, yet without them, bodies would remain where they fell, spreading fear and disease even further. Civilization depended on people it simultaneously feared and rejected. In some cities, officials attempted to impose order. They issued rules forbidding public gatherings, restricting movement, and controlling burials. These laws were rarely enforced. Guards died. Officials fled. Authority collapsed as completely as the markets and fields. Homes became strange places. In houses where everyone had died, doors remained open, windows shattered by weather and time, furniture untouched. Meals lay half-eaten on tables, hardened and moldy. Clothing hung where it had been left, never to be worn again. Entering these houses felt like stepping into a frozen moment of another life. Travelers reported entire villages without a single living soul. Churches stood, paths were overgrown. In some places, wolves and wild animals returned, drawn by the smell of death and the absence of humans. The psychological impact of this collapse was immense. Survivors lived surrounded by reminders of mortality. Every street, every building carried memories of people who were gone. Silence replaced noise, absence replaced presence. Grief became constant and overwhelming. At first, people mourned openly. They curried, prayed, screamed. Over time, grief exhausted itself. There were simply too many losses. Emotions dulled. People moved through their days with blank expressions, conserving energy for survival. Children suffered in unique and devastating ways. Many were orphans, sometimes watching their parents die before their eyes. Some were taken in by distant relatives. Others were abandoned entirely. Children learned quickly not to ask questions, not to expect comfort. They grew up fast. Did not grow up at all. The bonds that held communities together frayed. Neighbors who had relied on one another now avoided contact. Doors stayed shut. Trust eroded. Fear reshaped relationships. Even kindness became dangerous. At the same time, traditional roles vanished. With so many men dead, women took on new responsibilities. They managed farms, ran shops, made decisions previously denied to them. Survival demanded adaptation, regardless of custom, law. Time itself seemed distorted. Without work schedules, festivals, or regular worship, days blurred together. People measured time by deaths rather than dates. Before the plague and after the plague replaced calendars. Religious life changed dramatically. Some churches closed entirely due to lack of clergy. Others remained open, but nearly empty. Faith was not gone, but it was altered. Prayer became more personal, more desperate. Doubt spread quietly alongside. Belief. Moral boundaries shifted. Some people believed that if death was inevitable, nothing mattered anymore. They indulged in excess food, drink, sex, violence, seeking comfort or distraction. Others became stricter, clinging to rules as a way to impose meaning on chaos. Crime increased in some regions, with law enforcement weakened or non-existent. Thieves looted abandoned homes and shops. In other areas, communities turned inward, protecting what little remained with ruthless determination. The idea of the future shrank. People stopped planning years ahead. Evenmonths felt too distant. Survival was measured in days, sometimes hours. Long-term thinking seemed foolish when tomorrow was uncertain. And yet, beneath the collapse, something unexpected began to form. Survivors became aware of their value. Labor was suddenly scarce. A person who could work, who could harvest, build, or bury mattered more than ever. Though this realization would take time to fully emerge, the foundations were already being laid. The plague stripped society to its bare bones. It removed layers of tradition, hierarchy, and assumption. What remained was raw humanity, fearful, grieving, adaptive, and stubbornly alive. People learned quickly which skills mattered. Practical knowledge became priceless. Those who could grow food, repair tools, heal wounds, or organize labor became central figures. Survival rewarded competence more than birthright. In this broken world, small acts took on immense significance. Sharing bread could mean the difference between life and death. Opening a door could save or end a life. Choice carried weight they never had before. Every day that passed felt like borrowed time. Every sunrise was uncertain, and yet people continued. They woke up, they searched for food, they buried thread, they cared for the living, they endured. This was the third stage of Theplig experience, not the shock of arrival, not the horror of symptoms, but the slow realization that the old world was gone. Society had not paused, it had collapsed, and those who remained, forced to build some kind of life in the shadow of mass death. The plague was no longer just killing people. It was reshaping everything: work, family, belief, and the meaning of survival itself. And still worse was yet to come. As the plague continued its relentless advance, fear no longer stayed confined to Thebedy. It spread into minds, beliefs, and communities, reshaping how people understood the world and each other. Disease was terrifying, but confusion was just as deadly. Without knowledge, offgrams, or transmission, people searched desperately for meaning, and in doing so, they often turned on one another. Religion became the primary lens through which the catastrophe was interpreted. Medieval Europe was deeply religious. Faith was woven into every aspect of daily life. When the plague struck, many saw it as a message from God, an act of divine punishment for humanity's sins. The scale of death seemed too vast, too purposeful to be random. Surely, people believed this suffering had meaning. Churches filled with desperate worshippers. Men and women knelt for hours on stone floors, praying aloud, confessing sins they had never spoken before. People begged for forgiveness, for mercy, for one more day of life. Candles burned constantly. their smoke thick in the air. Hymns echoed through half-empty halls, sung by voices already weakened by hunger and fear. Priests were overwhelmed. They moved from house to house, administering last rites, blessing the dying, burying the dead. Many died doing this work, infected by the very people they tried to save. In some regions, entire clerical communities were wiped out. Churches were left without leaders, bells without ringers, congregations without guidance. As priests died, confidence in the church began to fracture. People asked questions they had never dared to ask before. Why wareth faithful dying alongside the sinful? Why did prayer not protect children? Why did God seem silent? These doubts were rarely spoken aloud, but they spread quietly, weakening the authority of religious institutions. For some, doubt turned into radical devotion. If God was angry, they reasoned, then suffering must be the answer. Groups known as flagellants emerged, moving from town to town in large processions. They marched barefoot through streets, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves until blood ran down their backs. They sang hymns of repentance, believing that public pain would appease divine wrath. Crowds gathered to watch these processions, some in horror, others in awe. Many joined them, convinced this was the only way to survive. Yet these gatherings became perfect breeding grounds for disease. The flagellants unknowingly carried the plague from one town to the next, spreading death in the name of church. Authorities eventually condemned these groups, seeing them as dangerous and heretical. But by then, the damage was done. Fear had already taken hold, and it was not limited to religious expression. As desperation grew, people searched for someone to blame. An enemy felt safer than an invisible threat. Rumors spread rapidly, fueled by panic and grief. Whispers claimed that wells had been poisoned, that the plague was a deliberate act. Some were ruse responsible. Minorities became targets. Jewish communities, already marginalized, were accused of poisoning water supplies or conspiring with dark forces. These accusations had no evidence, but fear did not require proof. Violence erupted. Entire communities were attacked, expelled, or massacred. People who had lived peacefully alongside their neighbors for generations were suddenly hunted. Foreigners, beggars, travelers, and the poor were also blamed. Anyone who looked different or lived on the margins became suspicious. Social trust collapsed. Fear justified cruelty in ways that would have been unthinkable before. In some places, town councils attempted to maintain order, issuing proclamations to protect minorities or punish violence. In others, authorities encouraged persecution, hoping to redirect fear outward rather than allow it to turn inward. Survival once again depended on location and chance. At the same time, some towns took steps that unknowingly saved lives. City gates were closed, travelers were turned away. Ships were forced to wait offshore for weeks before docking. People arriving from infected regions were isolated outside town walls. These early forms of quarantine were harsh and often deadly for those excluded, but they reduced the spread of disease. The word quarantine itself would later come from this period, rooted in the idea of waiting 40 days. Though people did not understand why isolation worked, they observed that it sometimes did. Observation, not belief, began to shape behavior. Inside these closed towns, Life was tense and heavily controlled. Movement was restricted. Guards patrolled. Streets, houses suspected of infection were sealed. Red or black marks were painted on doors. In some cases, entire families were locked inside their homes to die food delivered, if it came at all. This created new moral dilemmas. Was it right to sacrifice a few to save many? Could cruelty be justified by survival? These questions haunted survivors long after the plague passed. As fear intensified, so did superstition. Astrology gained new importance. People consulted star charts, believing planetary alignments controlled disease. Talismans were worn. Amulets were blessed. Charms were whispered. Rationality, already fragile, gave way to magical thinking. At Thesam time, some people rejected superstition entirely. They trusted only distance and isolation. They withdrew into themselves, avoiding all contact. Homes became fortresses. Windows stayed shut. Silence was safety. Human connections suffered deeply. Love, touch, and comfort were seen as risks. Parents hesitated to hold sick children. Spouses slept apart. Friendship, loneliness spread alongside disease. The emotional toll was immense. Constant fear created exhaustion of the soul. People lived in a state of permanent alert, waiting for the next sign of illness, the next bell, the next loss. Sleep was shallow. Dreams were filled with death. In this environment, identity began to shift. People no longer defined themselves by profession, family, or status. Survival became the primary identity. You were either alive or dead. Everything else felt secondary. Some individuals embraced fatalism. If death was unavoidable, they reasoned, then nothing mattered. These people live recklessly, indulging in pleasure, ignoring danger. Others clung to control wherever they could find it, enforcing strict routines, rules, and isolation. Both responses were attempts to cope with a world that had lost its predictability. Amid the chaos, quiet acts of courage conscience. Some priests remained at their posts despite overwhelming risk. Some families cared for sick relatives until the end. Some towns protected innocent, even at great cost. These acts did not stop the plague, but they preserved humanity. As months passed, the psychological damage became clearer. Survivors carried invisible scars. Many would never fully trust the world again. The sense of safety that once defined everyday life was gone. People began to realize that the plague was not just killing bodies, it was destroying assumptions about God's protection, about social order, about fairness. The universe felt cruel, arbitrary, and indifferent, and yet beneath this despair, change was taking root. People were observing. They were learning which behaviors increased survival. They were questioning old explanations, though they did not yet have science. They were beginning to develop somethingly powerful skepticism. The authority of tradition weakened. Experience mattered more than doctrine. What worked mattered more than what was believed. This shift would take generations to fully unfold, but its origins lay in this period of terror. The plague had forced humanity to confront its own vulnerability. It stripped away illusions of control and exposed the fragility of civilization. In doing so, it changed how people thought about responsibility, authority, and truth. This stage of the plague wasn't defined by sickness alone, but by fear turned inward and outward, fear of God, fear of neighbors, fear of the unknown. It reshaped belief systems, fractured communities, and planted seeds of both destruction and transformation. Those who lived through it did not emerge unchanged. They carried the memory of mobs, prayers, isolation, and silence. And still, despite everything, people endured, they adapted, they questioned, they learned. Even as death continued its work, the human mind was already preparing for a world that would have to be rebuilt from the ashes of belief and fear. Survival during Thepleg never followed rules that made sense. People searched desperately for patterns, convinced that if they could understand why some lived and others died, they might protect themselves. But disease obeyed no moral logic and showed no respect for status, virtue, or strength. It struck unpredictably, leaving behind survivors who struggled to understand why they had been spared. Wealth offered only partial protection. Those with money could flee cities early, isolate themselves in rural estates. Distance reduced risk, but it did not guarantee safety. Servants often brought the disease with them. Supplies ran low. Isolation became imprisonment. Many wealthy families died far from cities. They had escaped, buried quietly on their own land. Priests, doctors, and caregivers suffered some of the highest death rates. Their roles demanded close contact with the sick, and devotion became a death sentence. Entire monasteries disappeared. Hospitals lost staff faster than they could replace them. Knowledge and faith did not shield Thebedy. Peasants lived crowded, difficult lives, yet some survived in greater numbers than expected. Years of hunger, exposure, and physical labor may have strengthened their immune systems, though no one at the time could understand this. Others survived, simply echoes. They lived in places the plague reached later, or less intensely. Chance ruled everything. Children experienced the plague differently than adults. Many were spared at first, only to fall ill later. Others survived, while their parents died, leaving them alone in a shattered world. Orphans filled streets and shelters. Some were adopted, many were not. Childhood became brief and brutal. Survivors lived with constankrieth. The losses did not come one at a time, but in waves. Entire families vanished within days. Friendships ended abruptly. Familiar faces disappeared. What farewell? People stopped asking where someone had gone. The answer was almost always the same. Survivors' guilt became a silent burden. Those who lived questioned why they had been spared. Some believed survival was a sign of divine favor. Others felt cursed, for Seto live with memories of suffering. Joy felt dangerous, even disrespectful in a world filled with death. The psychological scars were deep. Many survivors experienced lasting fear, anxiety, and numbness. Sleep brought nightmares. Silence felt threatening. Normal sounds, a cough, a bell, footsteps in the street, triggered panic. Life no longer felt stable or predictable. Art, literature, and storytelling changed to reflect this new reality. Death became a central theme. Paintings showed skeletons dancing with the living. Stories emphasized the fragility of life and the inevitability of the grave. Humor grew darker. Hope became cautious. The phrase memento mori, remember you must die, was no longer philosophical. It was practical advice. People lived with the constant awareness that life could end suddenly and without warning. This awareness shaped behavior in profound ways. Some people embraced pleasure with urgency. If death was always near, then enjoyment mattered more than restraint. Feasts, drinking, and indulgence increased in some regions. Moral boundaries loosened. Traditional expectations weakened. Tomorrow was uncertain. Today mattered more. Others reacted in the opposite way. They became more disciplined, more eruged, more controlled. Order felt like protection. Routine became a defense against chaos. Rules, even harsh ones, offered comfort in a world without certainty. Family structures shifted dramatically. With so many adults dead, extended families merged. Children were raised by relatives, neighbors, or religious institutions. Some women never married, choosing independence over vulnerability. Others remarried quickly, seeking stability and protection. Gender roles began to change. With labor scarce, women took on responsibilities previously reserved for men. They worked fields, managed businesses, and negotiated wages. Survival demanded flexibility. Tradition bent under necessity. Communities that endured developed new forms of cooperation. Mutual aid became essential. People shared resources, protected one another, and enforced local rules to limit exposure. But where it survived, it saved lives. At the same time, distrust lingered. Many survivors never flew. Distrust lingered. Many survivors never fully regained confidence. The memory of abandonment, locked doors, and isolation left lasting wounds. Community bonds had been tested to their limits, and often broken. Religious belief emerged, transformed. Some people became deeply devout, convinced that survival carried responsibility. Others distanced themselves from institutions that had failed them. Faith became more personal, less dependent on authority. The plague forced people to confront mortality directly. Death was no longer distant or symbolic. It was intimate, frequent, unavoidable. This confrontation changed how people valued time, relationships, and purpose. Work took on new meaning. Labor was no longer just survival. It was power. Those who could work were valuable. Survivors realized their importance. This awareness would later fuel demands for better conditions and wages, though at the time it simply meant survival had leverage. Memory became a form of survival. People remembered who had helped them and who had abandoned them. These memories shaped future relationships and community structures. Reputation mattered deeply in a world where trust had been shattered. As the immediate terror eased slightly in some areas, survivors began to look outward. They counted the living. They assessed damage. They mourned properly for the first time. Masses were held. Names were spoken aloud. Grief, long suppressed, finally surfaced. Yet even as life resumed in fragile ways, no one believed the danger was over. The plague returned in waves. Each cough still carried fear. Each new illness reopened wounds. Survivors lived with the knowledge that safety was temporary. This constant uncertainty reshaped identity. People no longer saw themselves as permanent inhabitants of a stable world. They saw themselves as temporary, vulnerable, and this humility, born of trauma, altered how people thought about power and authority. Survival created a new social category, those who had lived through it. Shared experience became a bond. stronger than class or occupation. Survivors recognized one another in silence, in caution, in shared memory. The plague also reshaped attitudes toward death itself. Funerals on Silaboret became simpler. Mourning became quieter. Acceptance replacenil. Death was tragic, but no longer surprising. Children born after the first waves grew up in a world shaped by absence. They inherited land, homes, and roles meant for others. Their lives were built on loss they could not remember but felt everywhere. For survivors, life carried a dual weight, gratitude and fear. Every sunrise was both a gift and a reminder. Survival was not triumph, it was endurance. This stage of the plague experience was defined not by the spread of disease, but by its aftermath within living. It was the long, quiet struggle to exist in a world where death had rewritten every rule. People learned to live with uncertainty, grief, and they adapted, they changed, they survived. And though they could not yet see it, the choices survivors made, the ways they worked, believed, and remembered were already shaping the future of Europe. When the worst waves of the plague finally began to loosen their grip, the world that emerged wasn't familiar, even to those who had survived it. Streets slowly filled again, but with fewer faces. Fields were worked, but by different hands. The silence lifted, yet it never fully disrupted. Europe had not returned to normal. It had crossed into something new, shaped permanently by loss. The sheer scale of death had altered the balance of society. With so many people gone, labor became scarce. Fields still needed tending, roads still needed repairing, and homes still needed rebuilding. For the first time in centuries, workers held leverage. Peasants, who once had no choice but to accept whatever conditions were imposed upon them, began to demand higher wages. Some refused to work unless paid fairly. Others moved freely from place to place, choosing where they would labor. This shift unsettled the old order. Lords and landowners struggled to maintain control. Laws were passed attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement was difficult. Too many officials were dead, too many workers were gone. Power, once concentrated at the top, began to slip downward, not through revolution, but through necessity. Serfdom, long a foundation of medieval society, began to weaken. Survivors realized they were no longer easily replaceable. The idea that one's position in life was fixed by birth started to crack. Though change was slow and uneven, the seeds of social mobility had been planted. Cities rebuilt themselves cautiously. Some neighborhoods were abandoned entirely. Others were reorganized. Buildings were constructed with more space, wider streets, and better ventilation. Not because people understood disease, but because they had observed that crowded areas suffered most. Experience had become a teacher more trusted than tradition. Trade slowly resumed. Merchants returned, though routes had changed and markets were smaller. With fewer people, demand. Luxury goods declined in importance, while practical items, blacksmiths, carpenters, and builders, found steady work. Skills mattered more than titles. Medicine, though still primitive, began to change its direction. Physicians started to record observations rather than rely solely on ancient texts. They noted patterns, who fell ill, where outbreaks spread fastest, what conditions seemed to worsen survival. These notes did not yet lead to cures, but they marked a turning point. Knowledge was beginning to grow from experience rather than belief. Religious life also evolved. The authority of the Church had been shaken by its inability to protect the faithful. Some clergy emerged humbled, focused more on compassion than judgment. Others clung to rigid interpretations. Faith did not disappear, but it became more personal, less absolute. People questioned more openly. Why had some survived while others perished? Why had institutions failed? These questions lingered. Doubt became part of belief rather than its enemy. This quiet questioning would later fuel intellectual movements that shaped Europe. Art and culture reflected this transformation. Themes of death remained, but they were joined by themes of rebirth, resilience, and the passage of time. Artists depicted not only suffering, but survival. Literature explored human vulnerability and strength with new honesty. Creativity became a way to process collective trauma. Family structures adapted to new realities. Inheritance patterns shifted as land passed to distant relatives or even unrelated survivors. Women who had managed households and businesses during the crisis often continued to do so. Some communities accepted these changes. Others resisted them. Traditions struggled against necessity. Population recovery was slow. Entire generations were missing. Children grew up surrounded by absence. Yet life continued. People married again. Children were born. Laughter returned cautiously. Every birth felt like defiance against death. Memory played a powerful role in shaping the future. Survivors told stories of what they had endured. They warned their children. They remembered which choices had saved lives and which had not. These memories influenced behavior for decades, even centuries. The plague did not vanish entirely. It returned in smaller outbreaks, reminding people that safety was fragile. Each recurrence penned old fears, but it also reinforced hard-earned lessons. Quarantines were enforced more quickly. Isolation became a recognized strategy. Experience had taught caution. The psychological impact lingered long after physical recovery. Many survivors lived with anxiety and mistrust. The world felt unstable. Certainty felt dangerous. This awareness shaped a culture that was more skeptical, more observant, and more willing to question authority. Over time, this shift contributed to broader transformations. Feudal systems weakened. Educationally expanded. Curiosity grew. The rigid worldview of the early medieval period began to soften. Though no one living through the plague could see it clearly, the foundations of the Renaissance were forming. Survival had changed how people valued life. Time felt precious. Relationships mattered more. The idea that life should be meaningful, not merely endured. This was not optimism born of ignorance, but hope forged through. Communities rebuilt themselves around shared experience. The memory of collective loss created bonds that transcended old divisions. In some places, cooperation replaced hierarchy. In others, conflict persisted. Change was uneven, but it wasn't. The plague had forced humanity to confront its limits. It revealed how fragile systems were, how quickly order could collapse. But it also showed how adaptable people could be. When tradition failed, observation stepped in. When authority weakened, experience guided behavior. The surviving people had unknowingly stepped into a new era. They no longer saw the world as stable or guaranteed. They understood deeply that civilization was something that Hatobi maintained, protected, and questioned. The Black Death did not create a better world immediately. It created a changed one. Its legacy was written not only in mass graves, but in laws rewritten, beliefs reconsidered, and lives redirected. Those who endured carried forward a hard-earned wisdom that life is fragile, that power can shift, that knowledge must grow from reality, and that survival itself can be a force for transformation. They had lived through the unthinkable, and in doing so, they had altered the course of history, not through conquest or invention, but through endurance. Thepleg had nearly destroyed their world, but from its aftermath, time, this shift contributed to broader transformations. Feudal systems weakened, educations expanded, curiosity grew. The rigid worldview of the early medieval period began to soften. Though no one living through the plague could see it clearly, the foundations of the Renaissance were forming. Survival had changed how people valued life. Time felt precious. Relationships mattered more. The idea that life should be meaningful, not merely endured, gained strength. This was not optimism born of ignorance, but hope forged through communities rebuilt themselves around shared experience. Memory of collective loss created bonds that transcended old divisions. In some places, cooperation replaced hierarchy. In others, conflict persisted. Change was uneven, but it wasn't inevitable. The plague had forced humanity to confront its limits. It revealed how fragile systems were, how quickly order could collapse. But it also showed how adaptable people could be. When tradition failed, observation stepped. When authority weakened, experience guided behavior. Deserving people had unknowingly stepped into a new era. They no longer saw the world as stable, guaranteed. They understood deeply that civilization was something that had to be maintained, protected, and questioned. The Black Death did not create a better world immediately. It created a changed one. Its legacy was written not only in mass graves, but in laws rewritten, beliefs reconsidered, and lives redirected. Those who endured carried forward a hard-earned wisdom that life is fragile, that power can shift, that knowledge must grow from reality, and that survival itself can be a force for transformation. They had lived through the unthinkable, and in doing so, they had altered the course of history, not through conquest or invention, but through endurance. Thepleg had nearly destroyed their world, but from its aftermath emerged a society no longer willing to accept that suffering was inevitable, or that authority was unquestionable, or that the future was fixed. Humanity had been tested at its limits, and it had survived. In the generations that followed, the memory of the plague never truly faded. Even as new children were born in fields once again filled with grain, the shadow of what had happened lingered quietly in the background of everyday life. Survivors carried the past with them, not always in words, but in habits, fears, and instincts passed down like inheritance. The world moved forward, but it did so cautiously, forever aware of how quickly everything could be undone. Communities rebuilt, slowly and unevenly. Some towns never recovered at all, remaining empty or reduced to small villages. Others adapted, reshaping themselves around lessons learned through suffering. People paid closer attention to distance, cleanliness, and isolation, even if they could not explain why these things mattered. Experience had taught what theory could not. Older survivors became living witnesses to catastrophe. They told stories to children who struggled to imagine a time when bells rang without pause and streets were lined with the dead. These stories were not always detailed. Often they were fragments, warnings about overcrowding, about strangers, about ignoring sickness. Fear lived between the lines. This collective memory altered how people thought about risk. Where earlier generations trusted routing and tradition, survivors valued caution. Travel was approached carefully. Outsiders were watched. Though trade and movement returned, they carried a new awareness of vulnerability. The plague Alsace changed how people understood responsibility. Many survivors believed that survival came with obligation to build, to remember, to do better. Others rejected this idea, believing life owed them nothing and meaning was fragile. Both perspectives shaped culture in lasting ways. Education began to shift subtly. While formal schooling remained limited, curiosity grew. People wanted explanations rooted in observation. Why did disease spread faster in crowds? Why did isolation sometimes work? These questions did not yet produce a science, but they planted the seeds of inquiry. Governments, too, evolved under pressure. Authorities realized that ignoring public health had consequences. Though crude, early systems of record-keeping, inspection, and regulation emerged. Quarantine policies became more common during later outbreaks. These were imperfect and often cruel, but they represented learning. The relationship between rulers and Thorold continued to change. Survivors remembered how quickly order had collapsed when leadership failed. Trusting authority was no longer automatic. People expected protection, not just command. This expectation would later fuel resistance, reform, and rebellion. Economic shifts deepened over time. With labor still valuable, wages remained higher than before the plague. Skilled workers gained influence, guilds strengthened, opportunity expanded slowly beyond birthright. Though inequality persisted, it was no longer unquestioned. Women, having proven their capability during the crisis, continued to occupy roles once denied to them. Some communities accepted this out of necessity. Others resisted fiercely. But the idea that survival required flexibility had taken root and could not be fully erased. Culturally, the obsession with death softened but never disappeared. Instead, it matured. Death became a teacher rather than a terror alone. Art reflected balance, life and decay, beauty and impermanence. This perspective would later shape humanist thought. Religion adapted unevenly. Some institutions reasserted control. Others embraced humility. Faith became less about fear and more about meaning. The plague had stripped certainty from belief, but it had also deepened spiritual reflection. Perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. Survivors and their descendants lived with an underlying awareness that stability was temporary. This awareness made people cautious but also creative. If the world could end, then it could also be remade. This mindset encouraged experimentation. New ideas once dismissed as dangerous were explored. Old assumptions weakened. Intellectual curiosity grew slowly, fed by generations who had seen tradition fail under pressure. The plague also shaped how humanity understood itself. It revealed that humans were not separate from nature, not protected from unseen forces. This humility altered philosophy and ethics. Control was no longer assumed, it was negotiated. Stories of the plague became warnings rather than nightmares. Parents used them to teach resilience. Leaders used them to justify caution. Artists used them to explore truth. Memory became a tool for survival. As centuries passed, the Black Death transformed from lived experience into historical memory. Butit's influence remained embedded in laws, customs, and thought. The modern world was built, in part, on lessons learned in mass graves and silent streets. Thepleg had exposed the cost of ignorance, the danger of fear, and the power of adaptation. IAL. Death was tragic, but no longer surprising. Children born after the first waves grew up in a world shaped by absence. They inherited land, homes, and roles meant for others. Their lives were built on loss they could not remember, but felt everywhere. For survivors, life carried a dual weight, gratitude and fear. Every sunrise was both a gift and a reminder. Survival was not triumph, it was endurance. This stage of the plague experience was defined not by the spread of disease, but by its aftermath within living. It was the long, quiet struggle to exist in a world where death had rewritten every rule. People learned to live with uncertainty, grief, and they adapted, they changed, they survived. And though they could not yet see it, the choices survivors made, the ways they worked, believed, and remembered were already shaping the future of Europe. When the worst waves of the plague finally began to loosen their grip, the world that emerged wasn't familiar even to those who had survived it. Streets slowly filled again, but with fewer faces. Fields were worked, but by different hands. The silence lifted, yet it never fully disappeared. Europe had not returned to normal. It had crossed into something new, shaped permanently by loss. The sheer scale of death had altered the balance of society. With so many people gone, labor became scarce. Fields still needed tending, roads still needed repairing, and homes still needed rebuilding. For the first time in centuries, workers held leverage. Peasants, who once had no choice but to accept whatever handed to it, had shown that societies could collapse, but also rebuild stronger, wiser, and more aware. Those who served did not see themselves as heroes. They had not chosen endurance. They had simply lived. Yet through living, they reshaped history. In the end, surviving the bubonic plague was not about victory. It was about persistence, about continuing in a world forever changed, about carrying memory forward so that catastrophe might one day be met with understanding instead of terror. The people of the 1300s did not know they were standing at a turning point. They only knew they were still alive, and sometimes that was enough to touch everything. Thank you for traveling back in time with us today, witnessing what life was truly like during one of the most devastating events in human history. The bubonic plague reshaped society, faith, and the very meaning of survival, and its echoes can still be felt in the world today. If this journey through history resonated with you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves stories from the past, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive explorations of forgotten worlds. Your support helps us keep history alive, one story at a time. Until next time, remember, the past is more than dates and facts. It's the history of real people, their struggles, their resilience, and their humanity.